In the early days of the Second World War, as the Third Reich's army swept across Europe, another, more silent war was being waged in the cold, dark depths of the Atlantic. This was the U-boat war, and for a brief, terrifying period, it seemed the Germans were winning. From the second half of 1940 until early 1942, German U-boat commanders experienced what they called die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Winston Churchill himself would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. The threat was colossal. British and Allied shipping, the very lifeline of the island nation, was being systematically strangled. For the men commanding these iron coffins, success brought unparalleled glory. Names like Günther Prien and Joachim Schebke became household legends, their cheekbones glistening in newsreels as their boats returned to port, victory pennants flying high. They were the new knights of the sea, their faces printed on postcards for the Hitler Youth, embodying a romantic, heroic vision of naval warfare. The strategy, orchestrated by the cunning Admiral Karl Dönitz, was simple and brutal. Starve England into submission. Sink enough ships, cut enough supply lines, and force London to the negotiating table. To his young, fiercely loyal crews, he promised a long but ultimately victorious war. And in those early days, as tonnage counts mounted and Allied losses seemed insurmountable, that victory felt not just possible, but inevitable. They were the hunters, the masters of the deep, the celebrated wolf pack. But the heroic newsreels and the gleaming iron crosses concealed a dark, foul, and claustrophobic reality, a world of stench, sickness, and crippling fear that propaganda could never show. The truth of daily life aboard a U-boat was not a story of glory, but of sheer, primitive survival. The backbone of Dönitz's fleet was the Type 7 U-boat. It was a marvel of its time, but in reality it was little more than an updated version of a submarine from the end of the First World War. It was a submersible, not a true submarine, spending most of its time on the surface, a primitive vessel designed for one purpose: to kill. Crew habitability was not a secondary concern. It was barely a consideration at all. Imagine a steel tube, roughly 66 meters long. Now remove the engines, the control mechanisms, the batteries, and the 14 torpedoes. The remaining habitable space for a crew of 50 men was roughly equivalent to 2 modern subway cars. Within this cramped, suffocating tube, privacy was a forgotten luxury. The ordinary seamen slept amongst the very weapons they would use to send others to the bottom. At the start of a patrol, 6 bunks in the forward torpedo room had to be folded away to make room for spare torpedoes, forcing the crew into a grueling, hot bunking system. As soon as one exhausted sailor crawled out of a bunk, the next would crawl in, the thin mattress still warm from his predecessor. This was a world of constant, unrelenting human traffic. A narrow walkway, slick with condensation and diesel, served as the main artery of the boat. There was no escape from the noise, the smells, and the presence of 49 other men. Only the captain was afforded a sliver of privacy, a simple curtain he could draw around his quarters. But even he was not truly alone. Positioned next to the control and radio rooms, he could hear every order, every crackle of static, every nervous whisper from the outside, forever tethered to the fragile life of his boat. This was not a vessel. It was a crowded, iron tomb waiting for a reason to sink.
The single most defining characteristic of life on a U-boat was the stink. It was a unique, unholy combination of odors that assaulted the senses and clung to the men for months. It was the smell of 50 unwashed bodies crammed together in a poorly ventilated tube. It was the acrid, ever-present fume of diesel engines that coated every surface with a greasy film. It was the damp, musty smell of mold, which grew on the bulkheads, on their clothes, and on their food. And it was the sour stench of vomit from seasick crewmen, an unavoidable reality in the violent waters of the North Atlantic. One veteran recalled that when a U-boat returned to port and the conning tower hatch was finally opened, the shore crew would physically recoil from the wall of odor that erupted from within. You could, quite literally, smell them before you saw them. Fresh water was a precious commodity, strictly rationed for drinking and cooking. There was no washing, no showering. Shaving was forbidden. Each man was permitted the clothes on his back, a single change of underwear, and one pair of socks for a patrol that could last up to 8 weeks. They were issued a special saltwater soap to remove the crust of sea salt from their skin, but it was universally hated, as it left behind a scummy, unpleasant film. A deodorant called Russ was used to mask the body odor, but it was a futile battle against the overwhelming stench of their environment. Food was another saga of slow, inevitable decay. At the start of a patrol, every nook and cranny was crammed with the best provisions available: fresh meat, sausages, and loaves of bread. So much was brought aboard that one of the boat's 2 toilets was used as a pantry, stuffed to the ceiling with food. But in the damp, humid confines of the submarine, spoilage was rapid. Fresh bread would soon sprout white fungi, a sight the crews grimly nicknamed rabbits for its fuzzy appearance. After the first 2 weeks, the diet consisted almost entirely of canned goods, supplemented by a soy-based filler the military issued to U-boat crews. They unkindly called it diesel food, a nod to the exhaust fumes that tainted the flavor of everything they ate. Even the simple act of using the toilet was a trial. Until the food in the second head was consumed, 50 men had to share a single toilet, leading to predictably unpleasant emergencies. The flush system was a hand pump, and its use was forbidden when stalking an enemy, for fear the clanking noise or floating debris would give away their position.
For 2 years, the Wolfpack had reigned with brutal efficiency. But by 1943, the tide of the war began to turn, and the Atlantic became a far more dangerous place. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The Allied gain improved drastically. The Americans, with their colossal industrial might, entered the war, bringing more manpower and more escort ships. The Atlantic Gap, a vast area in the mid-ocean where U-boats had roamed freely beyond the range of Allied aircraft, was finally closed. There was no longer anywhere to hide. Allied technology took a quantum leap forward. New, more advanced versions of ASDIC or sonar allowed escort ships to maintain contact with submerged U-boats with terrifying precision. And perhaps most critically, the advent of effective airborne radar turned the sky itself into an enemy. A bomber, appearing suddenly from the clouds, could be on top of a surfaced U-boat in seconds. A good crew could crash dive in 25 seconds, but it was a desperate race against time they could not always win. But the most devastating weapon deployed against the U-boat arm was one the Germans never even knew existed. They believed their Enigma cipher machine was unbreakable, a guarantee that their communications were secret. They were wrong. Through a combination of Polish pre-war intelligence and the capture of a codebook and Enigma machine from the scuttled U-110, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were consistently reading German naval traffic. The Allies knew where the Wolfpacks were gathering. They could reroute convoys around them, or, with chilling new aggression, send hunter-killer groups to target the U-boats directly. The German commanders were baffled. They were being destroyed in such numbers, so inexplicably that conspiracy theories ran rampant through the fleet. The game had changed. The U-boat was no longer a predator. It was prey. The shift from hunter to hunted inflicted a profound psychological toll on the crews. The constant threat of detection, the ever-present fear of an attack from a silent, unseen enemy, created an atmosphere of unbearable stress. The most terrifying experience was the depth charge attack. Being trapped in a confined steel tube hundreds of feet below the surface while tons of explosives detonate around you is a horror few can comprehend. The hull of the boat would groan and shudder with each concussive blast. Light bulbs would shatter, plunging the crew into darkness. Cork insulation would rain down like snow, and the men could only huddle in silence, helpless, praying the next explosion wouldn't be the one that ripped their world apart. The Allied tactic of hunting to exhaustion was particularly cruel. Escorts would hold a U-boat down for 24 hours or more, relentlessly depth-charging them, knowing the submarine would eventually have to surface for air and to recharge its batteries. The feeling of utter helplessness during these protracted attacks was enough to break even the strongest men. The mental damage was profound. German Navy doctors, with no support from the Nazi regime, began to secretly document what they saw, a rising tide of PTSD. Men suffering from uncontrollable shakes, sleeplessness, and nervous agitation. In one horrifying case, a U-boat commander, in the midst of a depth charge attack, committed suicide. The loss of experienced commanders was catastrophic. The heroes of the happy time were nearly all gone by 1943. Their replacements were younger, less experienced, and their training had been shortened out of necessity. British interrogation reports from as early as 1941 noted that new crews were astonishingly inexperienced with fragile morale. By the end of the war, men as young as 22 years old were commanding U-boats, leading crews of even younger boys into a slaughterhouse. The glorious war promised by propaganda had devolved into a grim psychological battle for sanity itself. From 1943 onwards, serving on a U-boat became one of the most dangerous assignments of the entire war. The statistics are catastrophic. Of the 400 U-boats launched from 1943 to the war's end, a staggering 84% failed to sink a single enemy ship. The once feared hunters had become a fleet of ghosts, sailing to their doom with little to no effect. By 1945, the situation was so dire that statistically, a U-boat crew had a lifespan of less than one mission. It was, in the truest sense of the word, a suicide mission. The conflict had also grown more brutal. The old solidarity of the sea, the unwritten code where sailors would often help the crews of ships they had just sunk, was dead. Following the sinking of the Laconia in 1942, a ship carrying Italian allies, the U-boat that mounted a rescue was attacked by an American bomber. Hitler was enraged that they were picking up survivors at all. In the aftermath, Admiral Dönitz issued the infamous Laconia Order, forbidding his crews from offering any assistance to shipwrecked sailors. The war in the Atlantic had lost its last semblance of naval chivalry. When Hitler's suicide was announced in May 1945, it sent a shockwave through the fleet. For many, it was a relief, a sign that the end was near. For others, it was a profound disillusionment. Their great leader had abandoned them. Dönitz, in his new role as head of state, gave the order for the U-boat force to surrender. For many commanders, this was a dishonorable end. They refused to hand over their precious vessels to the enemy. Across the seas, hundreds of U-boat crews made their final decision. They opened a seacocks, scuttled their boats, and watched as their iron coffins slipped beneath the waves for the last time, choosing a watery grave over the humiliation of surrender.
The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest campaign of the Second World War, came at a staggering human cost. While Allied sailors suffered terribly, the fate of the German submariners was a catastrophe of unparalleled scale.
Of the men who served under Karl Donitz, 85% died in action, 30,000 German sailors lost to the depths of the Atlantic. The average age of those killed was just 22. The heroic myth of the U-boat ace, celebrated in propaganda and newsreels, stands in stark contrast to the horrific reality. The truth was not a glistening hero on a conning tower, but a terrified young man, stinking of diesel and unwashed bodies, trapped in a primitive steel tube, listening to the thunder of depth charges, praying for a survival he statistically knew would never come. They were not wolves. They were lambs sent to an industrial slaughter. Their story is a brutal testament to the true nature of war at sea, a grim saga of courage, suffering, and inevitable doom, played out in the dark, silent, and unforgiving depths of the ocean. The iron coffins that were once the pride of the Reich now litter the seabed, silent monuments to one of the most lethal military services in modern history.